Assalamu alaikum, I'm Carl Arrindell and you're watching In Focus. I'm delighted to be joined here in the studio by Dr Maha Azzam. Dr Maha Azzam is an authority on Islamist movements. Her doctorate at Oxford University in 1989 was a study of Egyptian Islamist movements in the Sadat era. She was head of the Programme on Security and Development in Muslim States at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, and since 2000, and until very recently, I'm told just this week, was an Associate Fellow of the Middle East Programme at Chatham House. She was one of 15 specialists at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies Transnational Threats Project, analysing the impact of Islamist radicals in Europe. Dr Azzam is now the chair of the Egyptian Revolutionary Council, a body made up of representatives of Egypt's opposition groups, including former ministers from the Ousted Muslims, Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party, and they're based primarily in Istanbul. Assalamu alaikum, Dr Azzam, and welcome to Islam Channel.
Wa alaikum assalam. It's very good to be with you.
Now, in an open letter just last week to the US President Obama, published to coincide with the Countering Violent Extremism Summit at the White House in Washington, and in your capacity as chair of the Egyptian Revolutionary Council, you contended that, and to use your words, the aborted Arab Spring was the first real blow against terrorism in the region, and which has regrettably been reversed, you said. Terrorism, you said, was in no small part due to the region's autocratic regimes, which employed terrorist tactics in oppressing their citizens. Was this opening contention a challenge to what you believe to be the official discourse of the West in understanding and dealing with the growing issue of terrorism?
It's both my firm belief, and I think it's also one of the basic tenets of the Egyptian Revolutionary Council, that terrorism and violence emanates from regimes like that of General Sisi in Egypt. It's the kind of terrorism that we really ought to be looking at with the same concern and apprehension in terms of security as the terrorism and violence that emanates from groups such as ISIL, and that essentially we should be fighting all forms of terrorism, and that ultimately the reversal or so-called reversal of the Arab Spring, and we can come to that, I don't believe it's been totally reversed, is really a blow to all those that want to hear the voice of the people in our part of the world, that want to ensure that there are rights for the citizens of any part of the world, and we are talking about the Middle East in this particular case in Egypt, but essentially the undermining of the democratic experiment, the democratic process in Egypt following the Arab Spring and the revolution of January 25th means that the space for all free voices, for any kind of free assembly, freedom of speech and so on, has been totally curtailed. And therefore it opens the door more to those who will argue for radicalization, for violence as an alternative. And that is the kind of contention that we put forward in the letter to Obama.
Now, you went further in the letter by stating that America's founding fathers believed that all of us are endowed with certain unalienable rights, among which are the rights to life and liberty. And you quoted from America's own Declaration of Independence. And you said the words, "To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." Now, I think that's just echoing what you were just saying. It has been suggested that the Middle East policy of the United States and Western governments tends to overlook its own constituted values in pursuit of short-term interests, the belief that stability is paramount at whatever cost. Is that your position? And to what degree is such a strategy flawed, especially given what you then referred to, I think, in the letter as General Sisi's military adventures in Libya?
I think the starting point of referring to the American Declaration of Independence is a kind of stark reminder to everyone, including American citizens and others, that what is happening and being supported in Egypt as elsewhere in the region by the US administration is completely contrary to the values that American citizens stand for. And that ultimately the Egyptian citizens are threatened in terms of their very life. This is not only about the luxury of certain aspects of a democratic system, the very essentials of the right to life, the right to freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, some of the core elements of any kind of democratic process, or basic rights as envisioned in the United Nations charters, or envisioned even in, religions, in terms of any ethical values that we speak of, are being denied to ordinary citizens in Egypt today. And that's why we refer to that in terms of the contradiction, the administration in the United States and other Western governments in terms of their policies vis-à-vis Egypt.
Now, in an article in the Financial Times earlier this month, it was said that, and I'm going to quote him, in the baleful shadow of the implosion of Syria and Iraq and the jihadi menace of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIS, that has stepped so violently into a vacuum, it is altogether understandable that the United States and Europe are being bounced back into an alliance with local strongmen. Are the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century perhaps a necessary challenge to the brutality of the fundamentalists in regimes in ISIS in Iraq?
On the contrary, I think I would challenge such a statement in terms of its very core. It's the very nature of totalitarian states and the policies pursued by dictatorship that have given rise to extremism and violence. So that kind of contention that somehow stability can be born from strong men, and it's not really strong men, we're talking about brutal regimes. We're talking about the likes of Syria, of Assad, who has been responsible for crimes against humanity, who has killed his own people in the thousands. We're talking about General Sisi, who has overseen the worst massacre in the modern history of Egypt. So we are talking about men who should be in front of the International Criminal Court. These are not, should not be described as strong men, which seems like a general kind of definition. It embodies much more, and it embodies brutality, it embodies regimes that have flagrantly abused their people's rights. And for the United States and any free nation and its people to support such regimes in the name of stability is, I think, abhorrent. And I think also in terms, if we want to be pragmatic, if we want to talk about stability, ultimately a regime that is chosen by its own people, that has to face some sort of accountability, and one that respects the rule of law, is probably a much better ally in the fight against terrorism than an erratic dictator that works on the basis of whim and ultimately may pursue policies that are contrary both to the interests of his people and also of the international community.
Now, the same article in the FT argued that in Egypt and elsewhere, by criminalising the mainstream Islamists such as the Brotherhood, it said, it brings more grist to the jihadist mill. The Brothers imploded after a year in government that was devoted to what it refers to as a sectarian power grab. Yet they won 5 votes in a row, and many of those votes cast for them will now buy the ISIS argument that jihad is the only way forward. Do you accept the notion that the Morsi government's failure was its sectarian power grab and following the brutal dismissal of a democratic process in Egypt by Sisi and its acceptance by the West, that the jihadi doctrine will be seen as the only way forward by many?
I think there are 2 aspects to that kind of analysis. The first one that I think is in itself flawed is that the Morsi period was one in which there was an attempt to establish a reformist government, a government that was going to really call into question the policies of the Mubarak regime and decades of dictatorship, that was going to slowly try to weed out corruption, to try to tax those that had avoided taxation, to assume reform that was going to be step by step. Any such regime, and I don't think it's the Islamist nature of that regime, although again during that year we didn't see any kind of Islamization, we didn't see what many called Ikhwanization of the state, that just did not happen. So any reformist state that would have come after the collapse of dictatorship was going to face what has been referred to as the deep state, the challenge of the deep state, the challenge of the military, of the security forces, of vested economic interests that didn't want to see change, and ultimately realized what they wanted through a counter-revolution. So
was Morsi's constitutional change, which everybody said was where he crossed the Rubicon, was that his big mistake?
Let's again describe that big mistake in terms of a man trying to stop the constitutional court that was in the hands of the military from ensuring that he could pass the constitution, because ultimately they wanted to dissolve the Constituent Assembly. The judiciary wanted to ensure the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly in the same way it had dissolved Egypt's first democratically elected parliament. Morsi took on those powers for a month and then rescinded them. What was happening in Egypt was a power struggle. It was a power struggle between those that wanted a change towards democracy and the judiciary, the military and the media that worked together to ensure that that democratic process failed. So it wasn't just the Muslim Brotherhood or Morsi, it was about the change and movement of Egypt towards democratization.
What did you make? What was the significance of the release this month of Peter Greste, one of the 3 Al Jazeera television journalists jailed for alleged support of the Brotherhood, and the release on bail of his 2 Al Jazeera journalist colleagues, Mohammed Fahmy and Maha Mohammed, who are to be retried for allegedly aiding the Brotherhood, especially in the context that in the same week the Egyptian courts passed death sentences on 183 Muslim Brotherhood supporters, almost without notice?
The jailing of these journalists, as we all know, remains a criminal act to which those who are responsible should be held accountable. Essentially, the regime of Egypt and that of General Sisi is responsible for what happened to them. And we know that there's been a great deal of international pressure, and we all welcome the release of these journalists. But we must remember that this is not any indicator that there's going to be respect for human rights, or that the Egyptian regime and the judiciary is going to in any way step back from its policies of ensuring that there is a continuing clampdown on all free voices in Egypt. Essentially, what's happening in Egypt now is contrary to all international law. We're going to see increasing use of the judiciary to justify maybe executions, continuing arrest and detention of dissidents. We have many MPs in Egypt's prisons, academics, students, women and children. What we're seeing in Egypt now is the continuing functioning of a military state that is going to ensure control and containment by any means. Egypt's jails are now full of maybe over 40,000 political prisoners. The release of some is not going to ensure in any way that this regime will look any better in the eyes of the world if the world is willing to really look with open eyes to what is happening in Egypt.
What about the complicity of Western governments? We can't help but notice the outpouring in terms of the international campaign for the release of the Western journalists. But there seems to be a blind spot when it comes to the plight of the thousands who were killed in Nada and Rubber Square. And as you pointed out, the over 40,000 who are incarcerated in a desert in brutal conditions, and many of who have been sentenced to death. How do you reconcile the responses from our Western media?
I mean, I think there has been a lot of demonizing of those who are imprisoned, or many of them. This is why it is so dangerous to divide Egyptian society and to somehow say that it's justifiable to imprison Muslim Brotherhood members or those who are sympathizers of Morsi, and somehow that there is this division that is being constantly reaffirmed. essentially what we're talking about is Egyptian citizens across the board who were peaceful protesters who played by the rules of the game and ultimately found themselves facing a counter-revolution and a military regime where all, despite whatever their political views, were going to come under the pressure and repression of the Egyptian state. So we also need to, I think, remind people that there are many in the world that, in terms of international human rights organizations, that have spoken out about Rabaa and Nahda, about those massacres, such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and so on. And there are a lot of people who are aware of what's happening. What we want to see is governments coming under greater pressure from their citizens and through their parliaments and so on to also express their anger that their governments are perhaps not taking a stronger stance or perhaps no stance at all when it comes to the situation in Egypt and the military regime there.
Now, General Sisi's economic reforms, his partial lifting of fuel subsidies with an apparent shift to more spending on education and health, have won him some praise, notwithstanding the billions of dollars that it has received from the Gulf countries, which have made some of those policies implementable. Is he doing something at least correct, or does the media reporting simply ignore the failed government promises on issues such as the minimum wage, the many strikes that seem to be occurring across the country, and the fact that inflation and unemployment rates are at the highest for decades?
I think the economic policy of the general have been an utmost failure. And ultimately, I think that's why he feels very squeezed, because not only on the regional and international front is he feeling some pressure, but I think domestically there's a great deal of pressure. The billions that have been poured into Egypt since the coup from the Gulf states have come to nothing. Essentially, the ordinary Egyptian citizen's lot is getting worse day by day. Very high inflation, 25% unemployment, and continuing corruption. And people are seeing with their own eyes that the figures that were part of the Mubarak regime, the old figures that symbolized that corruption, those fat cats that were in control, are all making a comeback. So I think the general and his regime will find that the pressure is on, and the forays into Libya and so on in order to deflect attention from the economy are not going to work. Egypt is a country of over 90 million people with serious demands in terms of what they need in terms of very basic requirements, health, food, education, and the situation is deteriorating by the day.
Now, was the overturning of the cases against Mubarak and his family members in the courts of Egypt for murder in respect to the deaths of, they say, more than 800 protesters, as well as corruption charges, inevitable? Is it simply a confirmation, as many have argued, many legal experts suggested, that proof of a return to the old regime? Were you surprised at how the news of this has been received by both the Egyptian population and the international community as a whole?
I think it's an endorsement that the old regime is back. And it's, in a way, the way that the military regime ensured that the business elite and the Mubarak elite were it made up for the fact that Mubarak was in prison, and it said, we've sorted it out, and back you come. So essentially, they want to say the old order is back, but of course it isn't. And I think the international community also is nervous because it knows it isn't, because since January the 25th, 2011, something has